Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Shared Services Link and sponsored by Taulia. Today, we'll be looking at how to become a top performer in the supply chain, financial supply chain, and we have some great information from you today from both American Water and the Hackett Group. My name is Sarah Fain, and I am the Head of Research at Shared Services Link, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Amy Fong, who is in the Procurement and Purchase to Pay Advisory Group at the Hackett Group, and Todd Smith, who is VP Supply Chain at American Water. You, of course, have a very important role to play in today's webinar, and that is to make sure that you get the most out of this hour. Please use this opportunity to submit any questions that you have to us using the chat functionality on the right-hand side of your screen. If you submit your questions to us, we'll answer them in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. And the earlier you ask your questions, the more likely we will be able to answer them in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. Touching briefly on the agenda for today, I'm going to open up with a little bit of context about why we're here today and what this webinar is all about. I'll then hand over to Amy, who will share some insight and research from the Hackett Group on the key trends in P2P and drivers for financial and operational success. We'll then hear from Todd Smith at American Water, who will address how American Water transformed their financial supply chain. Again, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session. So touching on context, all organizations, and particularly shared services organizations, find that lowering costs while also increasing value is a critical business objective, and it's one that applies to all kinds of organizations across all industries. And now, as companies across the world are looking for ways to both deliver cost savings while also increasing revenue, they're now looking to the financial supply chain to find ways to improve efficiencies, unlock new opportunities, as well as strengthen relationships with their suppliers. In this webinar, we will share some of the latest industry research in this area, as well as a very interesting case study from American Water. So with that, I'd now like to hand you over to Amy Fong from the Hackett Group.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm happy to be here today and appreciate Talia and Shared Services Link for hosting us. So I am a principal with the Hackett Group. For those of you who haven't heard of the Hackett Group, we do executive advisory, transformational consulting, as well as industry benchmarking, and we've been doing that for about 25 years. Personally, I specialize in purchase to pay and procurement areas. So I want to start by talking about the change that we see in the outside environment. And I think we're all aware that the world right now and the business environment is constantly changing at a rate of acceleration that we haven't seen in the past. Ever since 2008-9, we've been talking about this new normal, and things have really not slowed down at all. So when we look at the outside rate of change, there are things that are going on like hyper competition, there's extreme volatility in the markets, there's disruptive innovation. Any taxi driver who's faced with Uber understands what disruptive innovation is, and that's really affected almost every industry right now. Most of our organizations are dealing with this. And so we work with a lot of senior executives who are trying to understand how to deal with this change. How do we still succeed? How do we keep up with the pace? And the answer in Hackett's lexicon is agility. We need to be agile as an enterprise. And there are several things that I'll mention in a moment that enterprises have to do, but I really think that trickles down to every function and every process in the enterprise. So when we talk about the purchase to pay process or the source to pay process, we really have to think about how we're agile. And it comes down to digital and analytical and operational methodologies that match the inside rate of change with that outside rate of change. So at the enterprise level, we need to think about how we're customer-centric, how we listen to our customers and let their preferences and decisions guide our planning processes and guide our business decisions. In the P2P process, that references, our stakeholders, our suppliers, and our internal customers in most cases. Operationally responsive. So how do we swiftly respond to the changes in the supply chain, to changes in the customer preferences, to changes in the competitive landscape? As the business strategy of an organization changes, how do we respond to that quickly and react in an intelligent way? And I think when we talk about supply chain financing and the financial supply chain in general, there are many ways that our responsiveness with the cash, with working capital, enables this kind of change in the business, responsiveness in the business. How are we information driven? How do we make proactive decisions? And this one really ties in with the next step of how do we digitalize our value chain? How do we digitalize the information that we have so we can make more intelligent decisions based on facts, in a faster way? And that involves predictive analytics, that involves getting the information that's on paper into a digital form, and then being able to react on it. So when we think about this, this really affects everything we do in the source to pay process and everything we do in the business, and digitalizing, the procurement and the purchase to pay process. But it especially ties into what we call the financial supply chain. So I want to touch on that term. The term financial supply chain has been used for several years now in the software space, but really when you think about it, it's more of a process. If you think about the physical supply chain, that's very clear what we're talking about. It's the concept of, the materials and services that are building a product or a service, and there's a very clear chain of events that most organizations manage very tightly. The financial supply chain has more to do with the monetary transactions between trading partners for the purchase of goods, for the payment of goods and services. And on the buy side, the decision points here are the timing of purchases, the timing of inventory, payment terms, discount arrangements, and other things that will impact working capital. So we need to think about this. We need to think about the connection between the buyer and the supplier in both the order to cash and purchase to pay cycles. Your supplier's order to cash cycle mirrors your purchase to pay cycle. So thinking about how those two impact each other and how we come up with a win-win type situation is really important. In the past, there was often a push to push out, take a kind of very buyer-oriented angle with some of the policies, and that doesn't necessarily always work. When we look at the interests of the buyers and suppliers in the supply chain that are kind of laid out in this slide, you can see that the buyer and the supplier are both looking to unlock working capital. They're both looking to increase their working capital stance. So on the buyer side, it's increasing DPO, or days payable outstanding. On the supplier side, they want to decrease their DSO, or their days sales outstanding. They both want to optimize the return on cash. The supplier wants to get better access to cash and manage their liquidity risks, or minimize any risks from their liquidity or their credit. A lot of these points are really directly in conflict if you take them at face value. So to be successful in this more agile, dynamic environment, we really need to understand the impact of the decisions we're making and find combinations that balance the risks and the benefits and the impact to both the buyer and the supplier. And that's a better long-term view, especially when we're talking about higher risk suppliers. What we find is that there are some stages of maturity. There's a lot of different tools and enablers, and I'm going to say enablers versus tools because some of these are really broader than just a tool or a technique, but many different enablers in the financial supply chain. We find that most companies kind of start at a pretty basic stage and then move up. The first stage being basic payment terms management. So if you have, every supplier on a different set of payment terms, that's a pretty inefficient way to manage the business, and you probably haven't gone through and negotiated in a way that optimizes based on your company's goals. When you think about what your treasurer's goals are, whether it's holding more cash, whether it's taking discounts because you're, cash rich and the discounts on that will help the bottom line and help your profitability, or something in between. Negotiating and standardizing those payment terms with your suppliers is the best practice. That doesn't mean every supplier is on the same term. You may have a menu of 5 or 10 different terms that your sourcing team negotiates, and then your AP team acts on those and carries out what you've agreed to. And that's really important. You can do that in a paper-based environment. You can do it obviously in an automated environment. Taking early payment discounts is often part of that. So that's, we're going to pay in 30 days and we'll get a 1% discount or some variation on that. And typically you'll have the option to pay early or not. However, what we see with many companies is that in a paper environment, their AP processing time is so long, it's hard for them to capture consistently a lot of those early pay discounts. So the next stage up is invoice automation, and generally automating, digitalizing the AP process, receiving invoices electronically, routing them for approval electronically, and then finally paying them electronically. And this is, I'll say this is probably easier said than done. As we see companies, buying systems, their level of automation still may be fairly low in terms of the percent of invoices. But this is one that a lot of companies have gone through over the last couple of years. And you'll hear much more about this with American Water. They have a great example of going through these stages. And then purchasing cards sometimes aren't thought of as a financial supply chain tool, but they are key in working capital management. Purchasing cards, that typically the reasons for using them are different, but some companies use them specifically to be able to pay suppliers. The supplier receives a payment right up front, but your payment terms of the bill of the P card invoice are based on the negotiated terms with the P card supplier. And in many cases, even if that's not your objective, you do still benefit from that. The next stage is really when we get to a level that's more automated, and these are both highly dependent on process automation, dynamic discounting as well as supply chain financing. And dynamic discounting is just making those discounts available to suppliers at their discretion. So they choose whether to take payment early and offer a discount. And it's dynamic. They do it when they need to. They don't do it every month. That's hard to do in a manual process. That's easier. I do know a couple companies that have said we called up suppliers and offered them a discount if we paid early this month. And you can do that occasionally, but that's not really a long-term sustainable way to manage discounts. Supply chain financing, it's a little bit more complex, and Todd will talk a bit about how they handled supply chain financing, but it's essentially, either an internal or third party that's financing that time between the payment and when the supplier receives payment and when the buyer actually pays the invoice. There are many complex methodologies in that and different ways that it can be provided, but that's kind of the short explanation. So when we look at this, though, what we really find is that a lot of these more sophisticated practices are still fairly underutilized. So dynamic discounting on the left, we find only about 19% of supplier or companies actually have any suppliers on dynamic discounting. And I would guess that many that have some suppliers on dynamic discounting have just a few, not significant number. And I say that because most companies have, not 100% of their invoices automated. And automation, as I said, is really fundamental to this. There is a small group that has that will take a prorated portion of their discount, whether it's paid before the net term or not. But that's not necessarily the same as offering it to, your supplier determined dynamic discounting we're talking about here. We do see about 30% of companies looking at it, but it's not quite in place yet. And when we look at the right of this slide, when we talk about strategies around supply chain financing, the other feature at the top of that maturity pyramid there, we find that only a small percentage, maybe 6% of companies are using this, and another 11% moderately using this to support their supply base. So huge percentage here, about 61% not using this at all, or another 20% that are evaluating this but haven't put it in place yet. Supply chain financing really is a newer technique. Some companies are starting to investigate it, like you see here, and there are some great options out there. And for those that I know are using it, they do see some benefits. But as Todd will talk about, a lot of it is looking at the various tools and enablers available and deciding what's the right benefit to you. What are you going to get from each of these? We also see that of those that have implemented things, many of them have not necessarily realized the full value due to some of their internal efficiencies and the limited scope. So when we look at the challenges on the left side of the slide that companies are having when they're implementing treasury solutions, the number one reason or issue that's brought up is that processes weren't efficient enough to support the solution. And that goes back to what I said earlier about just not having the automation. Not having an automated invoice process means that it's really difficult to implement this in a fully on a wholesale basis. Also focusing on just one small group of suppliers. If you're focusing only on large suppliers, you're kind of sub-optimizing the return and investment from the project, or taking a one-size-fits-all approach, which I'll talk about supplier segmentation in a second. One-size-fits-all doesn't always work so well. It's also important to have end-to-end buy-in for projects like this, whoever the right people in your organization are. Working capital projects, payment strategy, it's really important to have procurement, sourcing, as well as purchasing, as well as accounts payable involved in that. And in many cases, Treasury drives that strategy. In other cases, they may not need to be involved, but just understanding the business's strategy is enough to come up with a plan to support it. But it's very difficult if your sourcing team and your AP team aren't talking to be able to implement these types of programs with suppliers. So having a common goal on this, having an aligned process and aligned metrics, even if you don't necessarily all report to the same person, it's very important. It's one of the reasons we talk about end-to-end alignment in the purchase-to-pay process. To the right, we looked at the percentage of DPO improvement from Treasury Solutions, and what we found was that the improvement was, a few days in some cases, but the majority of companies weren't really implementing these type of programs for DPO reasons. The key motivator for them was financial liquidity to their supply base, and I think this is an important point. There's certainly a working capital play here, and there's a value play, but having, managing the risk of the supply base and having liquid suppliers is certainly important. So we would, say to consider that as a goal if it's relevant to you, or for certain suppliers it may be. Jumping into, the types of suppliers that are important, I mentioned segmenting suppliers, and I think it's really important to consider the impact of these tools and these processes across your supplier network. So for those of you with a sourcing and procurement background, these quadrants of based on the business impact or value and opportunity versus the market complexity you're buying from, a pretty traditional model in the sourcing world. Segmenting suppliers into strategic or bottleneck or leveraged or routine categories. And in this case, we've added the dimension of risk as well, because high risk and low risk suppliers, based on whatever risk criteria is appropriate in your organization, is an important factor to consider. This actual breaking out of which suppliers go into which bucket here and what the right tools are might be a little different for every organization. So what I have here is an example of a framework. I wouldn't say that this is correct in the model to follow blindly in any situation, but thinking about it this way is important. There are certain suppliers that supply chain financing is a great choice for. Others that you might want to look at, dynamic discounting, you might want to just negotiate payment term extension, you might want to look at P cards as a solution. And you need to think about where you want to invest the time in implementing a more sophisticated program and where a simpler program might be appropriate. So what we always say is one size fits all is not a great direction to go. There's a couple different areas that you don't want to do one size fits all. First of all, you may have sensitive vendors. I do know of companies that had vendors that were nonprofits that they were supporting in scholarship type programs or, political type programs, and going to a extended payment term for those just was a significant impact to the vendor and had really bad PR implications. And so part of this process is, beyond doing a segmentation like this, manually reviewing the list of vendors and making sure there are no sensitive vendors on there that you should be handling differently. There are always some exceptions to the rule, and that's okay, but sometimes it takes a second or third set of eyes to go through that. And the other, scenario is large companies that I've seen, and there was one recently in Australia that rolled out a across-the-board payment terms extension, very significant, hit a lot of small vendors, and got quite a bit of bad press for that. Again, they may have had plenty of vendors that were fine with that extension and would have been minimally impacted, but the fact that they did it very broadly and without really great communication, it got picked up in the media. So that's also not what you want. There's certainly some sensitivity around this, but that doesn't mean you don't do it. It means that you take a more strategic approach to it and you think through these implications. So with that, I want to just wrap up with a couple of strategies to, when you think about the financial supply chain, how do you make it more agile? And I think that Todd's portion, his American Water example, really brings some of these to light. But when I think about this, the things that stand out to me are, you want to use your cash that's available to invest in suppliers by paying early. When it makes sense. You may not know the answer of, how much cash do we have available to pay suppliers, and does it make sense? Is the trade-off, does this, surpass our hurdle rate for other ways to use that cash? But understand that you should have some visibility into that strategy for your organization. Focus on shortening the invoice cycle time, both through automation and process improvement. So we have data on time to process an invoice. It should only take a couple days. If it's taking you weeks for a paper invoice to get received at a buyer and then sent to a central location and signed off and approved, that's too long. You're not able to make agile decisions. There are many ways these days to automate the process and also to streamline the process by, centralizing, standardizing, using various tools, even if you're not fully receiving electronically, like OCR, to streamline and make quicker processing time so you can make decisions earlier. Obtain management support for cross-functional collaboration. Again, anytime we're talking about optimizing the financial supply chain, you need to have leadership buy-in, and you need to have end-to-end alignment on what the goals are. And I've seen this in companies, if procurement is going out there and optimizing on savings and not paying attention to payment terms, and then AP is trying to pay as quickly as possible, not approve as quickly, but pay as quickly as possible, you're really not optimizing your situation there. And you're probably losing value. Where if you're marching to the same beat of the beat of the same drum, you're going to have better results for the business. Determine which suppliers are high value and most likely to find value in alternative financing arrangements. So again, back to that segmentation, whatever the right segmentation is for your business. But think about that. Don't just think of it across the board thing or an all of nothing or all or nothing, or just large suppliers versus small suppliers. That's a little too simplistic as well. And we saw in that data that suboptimizes. Really think about supplier adoption of tools and processes. So I didn't get into this a lot. We will have a paper coming out through Talia in a little while, and that does talk about some tips for supplier adoption. But for any kind of invoice automation process or payment process or payment strategy, like we're talking about here, supplier onboarding and adoption is a really, really key point. One of the key reasons we see these things fail is just lack of adoption by suppliers. That's the reason mainly that we see, only about 20% of invoices automated in the average company because they haven't gotten their suppliers onboarded. So that's incredibly important to put resources on. Promoting supplier adoption of tools and processes is somehow that got on here twice, so I'm going to talk about it twice. I did have another point, but I'll wrap up with that because I guess I can't overemphasize it. So let me pass the ball on to Todd now, who's got a great story, as I said, about American Water. And thank you, Talia and Shared Service Link, for having me here today. Happy to take questions as we get to the end.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm Todd Smith. I'm the Vice President of Supply Chain at American Water. I also have another role, which is I'm the procure-to-pay process owner. That's somewhat of an unusual combination, but it was very important for the success of this project. So I have the traditional supply chain responsibilities as well as oversight of the AP team from a process standpoint. They don't actually report to me. A little bit about American Water. We're the largest publicly traded water utility in the U.S. Publicly traded water utilities are somewhat unusual in the U.S. I think only 5 to 10% of the total population is served by an investor-owned water utility here. They're more common in Europe and elsewhere in the world. But we have about 3.3 million customers, 3.2 billion in revenue. We put a couple of $1 billion a year through our accounts payable process. One thing that's interesting is we're investing over $1 billion a year in infrastructure replacement for aging infrastructure. Of that, about $750 million a year is supplier-related costs on that, and that means we have a lot of contractors. And these are not big national contractors. They tend to be smaller local firms with less capital and borrowing at higher rates. But it also means we have a fairly fragmented supply base because the supplier that we might work with in New Jersey won't work with us in Pennsylvania, and certainly not in Indiana and other places. So that's where we're coming from. I want to talk a little bit about how we got here and our road to supply chain financing. This really came from a look at our accounts payable process. So about 2 years ago, we did some benchmarking, realized that our invoice processing costs were quite high. We had, not long before that, gone on to SAP. We're still seeing some issues with that, but just generally the way we were approaching it was driving a lot of cost, and it was about 99% paper invoiced process at that time. We do about 170,000 invoices a year, and we had one supplier on EDI. It was a relatively high invoice volume supplier, but that was it. And we had started a process of bringing other suppliers onto EDI, but we were finding that was a long and painful process, and particularly doing it one supplier at a time. I think after doing a couple of those, we realized that most of us would not be here when we ever got to a decent level, and we needed to find another approach. So we began looking for solutions and realizing that we had to go to electronic. That was the answer, but EDI was not the way we were going to get there. Also, some people think of emailed invoices and faxed invoices as electronic. They are not. You're going to take those invoices just like paper. You're going to put an optical character recognition process on it. And what we were seeing was that process was generating a lot of errors. Putting the amount in the wrong field or reading the wrong thing as the PO number or whatever it was generating a lot of work on the back end to clean that up. And we had a relatively low first pass yield on those types of invoices. Whereas the electronic invoices were doing a lot better, we just needed to have more of them. So with that, we started to lay out a business case. And again, we really started this from the perspective of, hey, we need to bring down the invoice processing cost. And we looked at that in terms of what we call touches. So any time that a human had to look at an invoice, that was a touch, recognizing that not all touches are equal. Some might take 5 seconds, some might take 15 minutes, but that was a thing that we could measure out of our systems, and we could really see what was going on there. So we said, all right, let's focus on how do we do touch reduction. A secondary thing was we did recognize we do have a lot of suppliers on traditional early payment terms, and that we weren't capturing those in a lot of cases, that we were leaving a lot of money on the table. We were in the high 60s, low 70s, I think, generally, and that if we could somehow capture those by processing invoices in a more timely manner, having them available for payment at whatever that early payment term was, that we would capture some additional benefit. And then as we started talking to suppliers, I think our eyes really were opened up to the potential for dynamic discounts. In my past lives, I've had supplier portals where really we're focused on the first two items. I think seeing now, coming back to this after several years, technology has really moved, and this is, dynamic discounts is a big part of the case here. So we looked at that. We built that into our evaluation. Now, for us, I think the disconnects that Amy was talking about are maybe not as big. We tend to be maybe not cash rich, but we borrow at a very attractive rate, and working capital is not the level of importance here as a public utility that it has been in some of my previous jobs in pharmaceuticals and medical devices. So I think we had some availability to consider paying earlier, particularly if we got a nice return on it. So I think that made a little bit of an easier issue for us. The other thing in terms of looking at discount capture, our standard payment terms are 45 days. We do have some suppliers higher than that. In terms of our corporate culture, we would not ever consider a unilateral terms extension. We have a lot of suppliers that are in the same communities that we serve. We see ourselves, we want to make sure our image is not tarnished by something like that. So where we can negotiate them, we do, but generally, we're sticking with that 45 days. So we've got typical terms, you're looking at about a 30-35 day terms acceleration by paying early, which not as huge as some companies, but that's kind of where we are. So ultimately, we selected a company called Talia as our supplier for our supplier portal, and there's a couple reasons behind that. One, the biggest one I think for us was that it was free to suppliers, not to us. Adoption was a big concern here. I think, as we looked at where we were on EDI, we wanted to drive a high level of adoption and drive it very quickly. And with past experience with other kinds of supplier, not portals, but we have a different solution where our high-risk suppliers register and we monitor their safety records and track certificates of insurance. And our experience with that was, they're paying for that, and we heard a lot of gripes and groaning, and some went so far as to invoice us for that expense. So it's like, if we wanted to get high adoption, we knew it had to be free to the supplier. So that was critical. Another thing that was very important to us was around the e-invoicing. We have a lot of non-PO invoices. We're continuing to reduce that, but somewhat the nature of our business is we have a pretty good chunk of those, and no PO, no pay. We actually have in place for certain classes of suppliers, but as an overall sweeping statement for the organization, that's a pretty far ways off for us. So being able to handle those non-PO invoices was also critical, and that disqualified some solutions. Then, the supplier financing option really around dynamic discounting was key to us. In our situation, we're doing this with our own cash. Talia has a solution where they can provide their cash, but for us, that was less interesting, but I know in some of my previous jobs, it would have been a very interesting option. So, other things we liked about Talia, frankly, we kind of generally liked working with them. We liked the solution that we saw. We, as a utility, we tend to stay away from SaaS solutions, but I think we found this was a very good one. The business case was there. They also have very good emphasis on supply chain financing as opposed to some of the other vendors that we looked at. So we worked with a company called Optima Consulting. It was kind of an interesting experience because as we were starting to talk through the content for this webinar, I was like, well, wait, who's Optima? I think it was so transparent. They essentially were a subcontractor of Talia, which worked out very well for us. We had one point of contact. This was a real seamless arrangement. In fact, I've never really seen anything like this where it was so easy that we really almost didn't know they were there. So very good experience with that on the implementation. So as I mentioned, adoption was key to us. So when we got into the rollout strategy, we're looking at a couple of things. First, we had to get them actively using the portal. And For us, up front, there was a big vendor master update campaign. We quickly realized that a lot of our data on contact information was very old and out of date, and we tried to reach out to suppliers with various things that we weren't getting responses, and a lot of that because we weren't talking to the right people. People had moved on, they'd left the business, whatever. So big push to get all that cleaned up. We also then went into a bigger enrollment push. So we got some suppliers will enroll in the portal because it gives them the ability to see their outstanding invoices and see when they're going to get paid, which for somebody in AR saves them writing a bunch of emails, waiting God only knows how long for responses. So there was an immediate value to the suppliers just in that, and we've had some suppliers that haven't progressed past that as much as we'd like them to. But getting them on and getting them to see that value for themselves was a key first step. Then from there to really get them to start invoicing, and they can see that as they invoice, they can flip a PO very quickly. They can submit invoices other ways. A lot of what we've been able to drive in our early conversion on e-invoicing has been suppliers that are kind of modest numbers because they don't mind going on and entering them manually or uploading a PDF, that kind of thing, manually. We are now in a stage where we're starting to push on the higher volume suppliers with other submission methods that are more geared for volume, basically similar to EDI. The other thing that we've been doing is education, both on the tool, how to use the tool, what you can do with it, the value you can get from it, but also on the ability to get those early payments. And we again have done some supplier segmentation there to try and identify who we thought would be the ones most interested in that feature, kind of the early adopters, and get them on. And we're continuing this education effort with groups of 20, 30, 40 suppliers at a time that we can bring into a webinar and kind of walk them through stuff. And some need that hand-holding. Believe it or not, we have suppliers that I think we have one supplier that doesn't have a phone in West Virginia. But so getting some of these guys, technology may be a little bit of a challenge, and getting them involved has been a process. So our goal has been to get to 50% adoption in the first year. So it would mean 50% of invoices submitted on the tool, and we are 50% of the way to our 50% of the goal actually very quickly. I've just seen the July numbers were a little bit higher here than we were in June, but looking at our June results of invoice volume, we need to go to the next slide. We have a third of our invoices submitted electronically. So following our implementation of Talia, we did have one more EDI supplier in the works, somebody that we'd identified kind of didn't do portals, and so we went ahead with that, and that's why you'll see a small increase on this timeline on the EDI. We have suspended all further EDI implementations. We're not planning to take anybody off of EDI, but we're not going that direction with anybody, although there is potential that somebody would request it, but right now that's kind of dead. But we've been able to, as I said, over the first 6 months, essentially 7 months since go live, drive a third of our invoice volume into electronic submission, with the vast majority of that being on Talia. As we start to think about that business case that we started out with, I'm a very firm believer in when you do a software implementation, you start with a business case, you stay on top of that business case as you make implementation decisions, and then when you're done, you track it. And so here we are, we've got metrics. The touch reduction, you'll see that we have reduced the number of PO touches by half for those Talia invoices. That has allowed us to already start reducing headcount in our AP department, which was one of our key goals, so it's been a very real cost savings. And that's been across both PO and non-PO invoices, so that's been a huge plus. With Talia, with electronic submission, we're also seeing a higher on-time payment rate. Now, there's really two pieces to that. One is you're taking out mail float. So, classically, if you've got a 2% 10 early payment term, you might be losing 3 days in the mail, another day to, get it out of the mailroom and process it into the system. And then you're looking at if it's a PO invoice, hopefully the receipts have been processed by then because the goods have physically been received. And if it's a non-PO invoice, you're waiting on somebody to put it through their approval queue. So by going to electronic submission, you're potentially getting the invoice the same day that the goods were shipped or the services were rendered, so that you're cutting out some of that time, and that alone boosts up the on-time payment. But there's also an important piece, which is error reduction. So as we looked at electronically submitted versus paper invoices, there was the electronically submitted invoices had an error rate that I think was less than half of the paper invoices. So they're much more likely to go through the system without being touched by human hands, or to require less intervention. And so guess what? They get paid faster. So the increase we've seen in the non-Talia on-time payment has resulted directly from freeing up resource. So as I said, we have reduced some headcount, but we've also kind of been able to free up some headcount to catch up on some of the paper invoices, and that's seen a lift in payment. So the other thing that we've seen, as I mentioned, our second point in our business case was getting at the traditional discounts. And what we see here is, if you look at our capture rate, we've brought that up about 12%, comparing the first 6 months of 15 to the first 6 months of this year. That's been quite significant for us in terms of the dollars we've reaped from those traditional discounts, and that's been a significant contributor to our business case, actually more so than I thought it would be. So a very pleasant surprise there. And then as we look at the incremental discounts that we've gotten through Talia, now here I'm specifically talking about dynamic discounts. So the green bars you see here are the traditional discount terms, and you'll see that there's been an increase in the amount there. But we've also layered on top of that the dynamic discounts. So Talia is contributing basically a little more than a third of an increment on top of our traditional discount terms, and that's been huge. So between all of these things, as a utility, given that Talia is a software as a service, we actually pay that, but we amortize it into the P&L every month. So by, I think, March, we were able to get 4 months in, get to a point where the savings from Talia were exceeding that amount that we were invoicing into the P&L. So that was our break-even moment. And since then, obviously, everything's been gravy. So we've been really happy with this as a solution. And also our suppliers have been very happy with it as well. So it's been a real win-win. Things, as I mentioned before, that we've done with suppliers where we required them to, get into a portal or register with some kind of vendor, have been mixed, a lot of griping. I have not heard any griping about Talia. I think they really see the benefits. They're all, everything that I've got, every feedback from a supplier has been very, very positive. So that's been really good for us. It's also kept down any complaining from our business partners, because suppliers aren't complaining to them either. So all around has been very good. In terms of what we're doing next, we're still pushing on the outreach programs. We're kind of getting to the end of our enrollment and onboarding. Basically, at this point, we're in follow-up mode. So we have a lot of suppliers that we invited that didn't enroll. Now going back, trying to understand that, any supplier that we happen to be on the phone with for any reason, if they haven't enrolled in Talia, that's one of the subjects that we cover. And we're finding that, even though we scrubbed the contacts, there's still some contacts that weren't the right ones. Doing supplier education and, working on the relationships. So, again, overall, it's been a very positive experience with us, and the immediate results have been just wonderful. So that's where we are. Kind of key takeaways. Having the alignment. I had the advantage that I didn't have to convince another executive between supply chain and P2P, because I have both roles. We obviously involved Treasury fairly early. That for us was a pretty easy discussion. allowing us to move ahead. So that was key. We are, pushing hard on this. As VP Supply Chain, everybody in supply chain has this in their objectives to drive Talia. We also have it on the AP side, so we're all aligned on objectives and to hit our, 50% invoice volume goal for the end of the year. So that has been critical in achieving the success that we have, and the fact that we're measuring. So we had some skeptical business executives when we started this process. The fact that we can measure and say, look, this is the business case we gave you, we're exceeding it at this point, has been great in terms of those relationships. And actually, some of them are now pushing. It's like, well, why aren't my suppliers, using it, and can I get, some more of these dynamic discount savings? So altogether, great experience. With that, I'd like to turn it back to Sarah for questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Todd. And thank you, Amy, as well, for some really great presentations with an awful lot of great data there. I would just like to remind anyone still on the webinar, if you do have a question, please use the question functionality to submit questions to us, and I will put them to Todd or Amy. So one question, I think it applies both to Todd and Amy. So I'll put this to you, Amy, first, and then to Todd. And that's the question about why dynamic discounting is more popular than supply chain finance. So I suppose, Amy, why do you see more organizations, as you shared a stat, are using dynamic discounting as opposed to supply chain finance? And then to Todd, why was this a more popular option for you than supply chain finance?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I would say that probably a big portion of it is that dynamic discounting has been around, I believe, longer and is more, is better understood by a lot of people. If you've already been doing regular discounts, going into a dynamic discounting type model is very easy to explain. Supply chain financing is really newer to the market, I believe, and I think it's a little harder to explain. I think Todd will probably answer, based on his own experience of what's going to bring the most value to the organization. And really, it's up to every company to look at, if we don't have either, what's going to bring us the most value to us and our suppliers. And in many cases, dynamic discounting gets what they need, right, without going into a more complex process. I also think that supply chain financing, a lot of people just don't completely understand it yet. It hasn't really been vetted out. There's certainly some, a lot of newer models and opportunities available, but not everybody is aware and has really vetted those out. So that's my thoughts on that one.
Yeah, so I would echo some of that. I think as we've started to look at it, supply chain finance is fairly new. It's an active discussion for us with our treasury team, but based on the early discussions, I think we feel that we're going to get more value from dynamic discounting. I would also interject a supplier perspective on that, and I think, the suppliers, some of them are looking at it and it's like, I don't need that incremental or that, I don't need that cash flow all the time. So I want to have the flexibility to go get it when I need it. Dynamic discounting is really great for that. I don't have to go to the bank and sign all the paperwork and, kind of get this whole thing set up. I can do it invoice by invoice. And, I can decide now, and 5 minutes later I can have a payment coming, right? So I think they like that flexibility and, the ability to sort of only give up that discount when they feel they need to.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, Todd. And I'll add to that. I actually had an experience with supply chain financing almost 18 years ago in a previous life with a large company I worked for, and one of our very significant, strategic suppliers that was in financial distress, and we came up with some supply chain financing type methods to support them. They ended up going under anyway, but it was a short-term solution. It was a very one-off type solution to do that, and in a special situation where a supplier really, really needed it. I believe that the bucket of suppliers that probably need that type of ongoing support is smaller than those that will opt for short-term support at their discretion, like you get through dynamic discounting. I can choose whether I need this payment early this month or not, versus being kind of I don't think stuck is the right word, but committed to a longer-term supply chain financing option. There are certainly suppliers where it's very appropriate, and you might want to look into that option, but not necessarily as many as are interested in supply chain in dynamic discounting.
That's great. Thanks both for a really thorough answer on that one. A question for you, Todd. You spoke about the ease of implementation and how quick and the speed of the ROI on this as well. However, were there any unexpected issues that did come up within the Thalia implementation?
Nothing really significant. So implementation for us was about 4 months, I think maybe 4.5, something like that. It went very quickly. We did have, the usual, a few bugs here and there in testing, but nothing that was significant, nothing that really created a delay. And since we've gone live, I think we initially did not include the non-PO invoicing. I think we brought that in a couple of months later. But generally, I've been very pleasantly surprised at how smooth it was. And that's, having been through a number of software implementations in my life, this was probably one of the smoothest.
That's great to hear. Some questions here. I think I'll bundle these ones together for you, Todd. Someone's asking, was there an existing workflow in your ERP, and how did the Thalia solution interact with your existing approval process or your existing workflow?
So we had existing workflow in SAP. Thalia basically interfaces into SAP. You have to think of it as a solution that puts the invoice into the system, but once it's there, everything is just the same as it was with the paper invoice. So the workflow, the process, the approval process, everything is identical, which was great because there was really no change management for us to do on a user standpoint. Somebody who's paying invoices doesn't necessarily know that it's a Thalia invoice versus a paper invoice when they're going through and processing it. The same is essentially true in AP. The only difference being that the image is a image that we generate as opposed to an image of the paper. So that made things really easy. We had a lot of those questions coming up from the business as we announced that this was coming, and it was like, you guys aren't going to really see anything different. It's the suppliers that are going to see the difference, but the business, no.
That's great. Thanks so much for that answer. Another question I'm going to put both to Todd and Amy. So for Todd, someone's asking, what was your end state goal for percentage of invoices going through Thalia e-invoicing? And then, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Amy, for a statistic, but what would you say are some goals to aim for a top performer? Some kind of percentages of invoices that is achievable for top performers, kind of rates of e-invoicing. So Todd, what's your goal in terms of e-invoicing goal?
So our goal for the first year was 50%, and then growing 10% a year thereafter. Now we did this on a 3-year business case, so our exit was at 70%, but our expectation was if we continue, it'll continue to grow after that.
That's great, thanks. And then Amy, can you shed any light on where kind of...
Sure. So off the top of my head on our metrics around percentage of invoices received electronically, peers are around the 19-20% range, and top performers, top P2P performers are around 70%. Honestly, I think that having a target in the 70, 80, 90% is ideal long term. Understanding you're not going to get there all in one space or all in one phase. I think that 100% is probably not quite doable, but you can supplement that, if you can get to 70 or 80% and then use things like OCR to put more efficiency in the process where you do have to use paper, that's really the best case scenario. What I tend to see is people saying we're going to get to 50 or 70 or 80%, and then getting to about 20% and kind of moving on and not really following through on phase 3, 4, 5, and 6 of implementation and onboarding. So that's a challenge. I do know companies out there who are in the high 80s, 90%. There are certainly they certainly exist, but they are, not the norm at this stage in the market.
That's
and
great.
that's my experience as well, that there are some out there, and some you have to challenge a little bit, because to some people electronic invoicing means they got it in email, which is and we have pretty specific details on that. Let me clarify that. For us, electronic means it's in a readable electronic format, not a PDF attached to an email. If you're just reading it off a PDF, that's scanning, that's OCR, intelligent data capture, not an electronic, submission like an XML format. So I know this is one of my favorite metrics that I hope will increase in the near future. Haven't seen a lot of movement in that 19-20% in the last 5 years, despite a lot of investment. So it's one that we really focus on a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And it's very much in line with what we see in the market as well. I've got another question for Todd. Todd's listeners saying that you mentioned a 4-month break-even period in which your costs for the Thalia solution and what you felt were your savings evened out. So they're asking, how far are you with the solution? And can you talk about where those savings came from, in addition to staff reduction? Is it mostly from the dynamic discounting?
Yeah, well, it's from both. It's from the increase in capture of the traditional discounts, and from the dynamic discounts. So I have to think about how those quite compare without putting out the specific numbers. But in terms of kind of being relative to break even, as we looked at this solution, we realized early in the business case that we couldn't pay for it just with staff reduction in AP, that we needed more. If I look at that just combined with the increased capture of traditional discounts, that makes the business case right there. And then all the dynamic stuff becomes just gravy. I think in the long-term business case, it's probably 60 to 70% dynamic discounting is in terms of the benefits.
That's great. Thanks so much. Another question for you, Todd. On what parameter did the Thalia release stand out for you as a choice from the competition? And feel free to name names or not, but what were some of the other vendors that you may have looked at?
Well, I think, so we looked at a number of vendors. It really came down to SAP versus Thalia. We're primarily an SAP shop, and if you are an SAP shop, you'll know your IT folks are like, oh, everything SAP. And so they were kind of pushing us that way. And then we looked at some of the other solutions we looked at, we just didn't feel were quite at the same level of maturity. There were two big elements of the decision in terms of why we went with Thalia. One was price, frankly. The other, though, was the free element, right? So my perspective was, even if SAP was a better solution, we didn't think it was. Actually, we really felt that Thalia had the superior software solution. But even if SAP was better, the fact that they charged the suppliers to participate was a huge negative. And we felt that that would have such an impact on adoption as to, that was a real strike against the SAP Ariba solution.
That's great. Thanks so much, Todd. One more question I'm going to put to you, Todd, again, is were any of your smaller non-PO vendors, were they all open to this solution? Did they take any bit more pushing or convincing?
It's kind of all over the place, and I don't think we've done enough analysis yet to really have a great understanding of exactly who's adopting and who isn't and why. As I mentioned, we did do some supplier segmentation in terms of who did we want to invite first, what were our priorities, and we continue to evolve that as we see who's enrolling and who's taking the discounts and that kind of thing, to try and get to a better understanding of, hey, who is the ideal, Thalia candidate. But it really varies, right? You don't necessarily know just the type of supplier or like what they're providing for you, what their capital needs might be, right? So that's kind of, company by company and their particular situation and the like. But I think the sweet spot for us so far has been companies that do I'll say a moderate number of invoices, right? So the guy who does 2 invoices a year, we didn't put them first, and the guy who does 2,000 invoices a year, we didn't put him first either, because they're going to be more oriented toward an electronic submission method, again, similar to EDI, but through Talia. So we kind of hit that mid-market as our starting point.
That's great. Thank you very much, both. As we're nearing the hour, I would just like to say thank you again to Amy for some great presentations and some great answers. Thank you very much, Todd, for sharing your really excellent story with us today. And I'd also just like to bring up that anyone on the webinar who's registered, you will receive the slides, and they will come from Talia. So if you'd like to follow up with them, that's a good opportunity to do so. Just like to bring up thank you again to the speakers, and let you know that we have quite a lot more content coming up on Shared Services Link webinars, and we also have a few conferences in the pipeline. So we do hope to see you at one of those in the near future. Thank you very much again to our listeners and speakers, and we hope to welcome you next time. Goodbye.